All right, so Adam Roseman is the CEO of Steady, which is an app designed to help self-employed and gig workers access resources and benefits and career mentorship, and so many more important pieces, really with the primary goal of creating a more steady income. So we can start to see why it is that you guys have started to land into the guaranteed income space. We're going to talk a little bit about that, your app and the work that you do. But one thing that's been really exciting and important over the last year or two is that you guys have started to move into direct cash. And so I want to make sure we have a chance to talk a little bit about the kind of inception of that, the inspiration for that, and then also what this last 12 months has looked like for you guys, which has been a bit of a whirlwind and pretty fantastic. So let's start with the beginning, really, of how you guys started to think that cash and direct grants, and there's this need for something other than just helping provide people to find better work or more shifts and more income through a kind of traditional work space.
Sure, I appreciate that, Stacey. Thanks for having me, and thank you for the continued work that you're leading through the income movement. So glad to be here today. So yeah, I mean, at its core, Steady is a data platform, right? And all those things you talk about, we do because we have access to a tremendous data set across our nearly 4 million members now on our platform that consists of predominantly hourly and gig workers, right? And so for us, historically, our focus was on taking all of the income data that we have relative to individuals and providing them with more transparency around what type of work they could do to increase their income potential. In order to do that, first we had to understand their income, right? And we do that through the connectivity to their financial accounts, things like their bank accounts, their payroll accounts, et cetera. And we utilize that data to help make recommendations to them. So once we started to understand their income, we became very fearful at what we were seeing, right? Specifically with a large portion of our audience being individuals who have no safety net. And so when we saw drops in income, expense shocks, we saw tremendous financial pain, right? And we could see this through the data, right? Through access to their financial accounts. So we saw things like a reduction in food expenditures. We saw things like just a dramatic drop in income, right? For individuals, we saw the increase in usage of payday loans and credit cards, things that just overdraft fees, things that just demonstrate very negative situation. And so for us, when this happened, we had the fortune of partnering with a group called the Workers Lab in the Bay Area, who we worked together with to establish in 2019 an emergency cash grant program for gig workers in early to mid 2019, who again had no safety net. And so we identified those workers when we had them on our platform who had income loss, right? And we deposited cash into their accounts, no questions asked, right? Because we have that direct access to their deposit accounts. We then measured the outcome and looked at those individuals who received the cash versus those that didn't, and were blown away by what we saw, which was with a single deposit of between $500 or $1,000 to $1,000, those individuals that received cash versus those that had had similar income shock, those that received it outperformed in earned income, right, from work by 41% in the following 6 months, those who didn't receive the cash, right? And then when we started combining that with our qualitative analysis, with dialogue with these individuals, we saw, listen, they were able to pay the bills. They were able to put food on the table when that shock occurred so that they could focus on solving the bigger problem, rather than simply having to worry every day about how do I make $50 to put food on the table, right? And so that really kicked off this interest. So when the pandemic struck, we had built this platform that enabled us to identify income loss, distribute cash directly into their deposit accounts, and measure impact, right, through the continuous linkage to the deposit account. So the Workers Lab and us teamed up again and raised millions of dollars that we were then able to do the same thing with at scale, just given how many individuals had lost income, right? What that led us to then last year was a partnership initially with Humanity Forward, to start to automate and provide scalability to universal basic income endeavors, right? Because they've historically been so manual. So for us, utilizing our system, they were able to quickly scale programs so that, again, they could quickly identify cohorts, distribute, measure outcome without having to worry about all of those various different pieces. And that led us now to partnering with I also call them Merit Hub still, but with Merit Hubs and MGI to provide the technical foundation for over 20 of the city participants.
It's so amazing, kind of the in a very short amount of time, going from, okay, we see what's going on with our members, and we're going to give, one-time cash grants to help them through these like very, very difficult times, to realizing that that there's already things out there, programs out there that are doing this on a regular basis, that are thinking about what would it mean to have an infusion of additional money, of additional income every single month. And it feels so much like the timing of Steady, and not just the timing of you as an organization, but that you are you talk about data and like the use of data and thinking about data, and in many ways, I mean, we know that banks right now, and there's a lot of institutions that have access to all of that data. What they choose to do with that data is something very different. What you guys are choosing to do with that data is give it back to the people, to give it, do intelligent things with it that helps them know how to take action, helps them know what to do, what next steps they need to take. And so like the transparency of data and the sharing of data and sharing of the bigger vision of what you're seeing, so that others can learn from each other, is just so important and impactful. And in some ways, I think of like, you guys are the data for good kind of side of things. I think a lot of us as users, where you're like, oh my God, there's data, like there's banking data, like they're seeing that, like, oh my gosh, what does that mean? When it gets translated into things like, well, we know who's hurting, and we can make sure they get cash right away. That immediacy and the ability to be able to do that is just so important and so critical.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
So tell me a little bit more about the pilots themselves. So you're lining up to do distribution for over 20 pilots across the country. Tell me a little bit about what that looks like, and what your kind of goals are, or how you're using your platform to be able to do that.
Well, the amazing thing is, Stacey, that we'll run those 20 pilots with one person. Okay. And so for us, certain cities have identified cohorts that they'll direct to link up their accounts to the Steady app. In most instances, we're identifying cohorts for them based on our member population, right? They're giving us the definition of what they want those members to be, and we're presenting them with different cohort ideas, and they're selecting those, right? So once that happens, we automate the cash distribution because we have the connection to their accounts. So we don't have to worry about putting it on a payroll card, and are they getting it? And is that payroll card usable different, that prepaid card usable different places, right? We don't have to worry about that, right? And so for us, we're putting it into whatever account they use, which quite frankly can also be a digital wallet. So if they're using Venmo, they're using Cash App, they're using PayPal, right? It doesn't need to be a traditional bank account. So we're trying to capture, virtually everyone, right? And hopefully we can capture everyone. And then from there, right, once the cash is distributed, we have that continued connectivity to the deposit accounts, right? And so for us, we're looking at what happens to their income, right? Over what time period once they start to receive the cash grants. In addition to that, what happens to other financial health metrics in their deposit account? Do their overdraft fees alleviate? Do their use of payday loans alleviate? Do things like use of credit cards, do they start to pay down credit card debt, right? To the extent that they have it. A variety of other metrics that we can look at to view those individuals. And then the great thing is that because of the size of our member base, we build control groups, right? So those that are lookalike audiences that aren't receiving, unfortunately, participation in the funds. Hopefully, eventually they all will. That's why we're doing this. But for today, those that aren't, we're able to use those as a control group to measure what was the performance of those that received cash versus those that didn't, and provide that data together to the Center for Guaranteed Income Research, right, with Stacey and Amy, who you know well, they're amazing, for them to be able to write research that hopefully then helps to influence policy. But I think the main takeaway is that historically massive manpower requirements to run a UBI endeavor, right? Going out, sending people to manually find cohorts, figuring out how to get each of them money, making sure they got the money, like interviewing all of them and having to rely on imperfect data because they're getting interview data only, right? And that all required manpower. We're running 20 cities with one person, right? Because of automation, one person total. So, for us, that's what this is all about, right? One quick tangent is that we're trying to extend this into other mechanisms for cash. So today, in fact, it was announced by the state of Louisiana, our first partnership with the state to accelerate benefits for 1099 workers to receive what has been a year-plus backlog for CARES Act pandemic unemployment benefits, right? Individuals that applied over a year ago, but because of the manual processing requirement, because the 1099 workers, states and state agencies don't have access to that data, they didn't receive their benefits. We're automating that all away so that we can clear that backlog out immediately, right? And they came out with the press release on that today. So the technology exists, right? And it just needs to be deployed so that we can actually create scale and make these things be on the scale they need to be and provide the data necessary to hopefully really influence policy.
Well, and what you start to get at, I think I'm gonna quote the data wrong, so I apologize ahead of time. But in like the state of Mississippi, I think it's something like 4% of people who should be receiving some kind of benefit are actually receiving it, and whether that's because the system is intentionally designed to limit the number of people to have access, or just the kind of broken nature, the nature of so much paperwork, so much disconnection between what somebody who's trying to access those funds or those programs, what they need to do versus what they actually even have access to and are able to provide, especially as 1099 workers. It feels like really what you're talking about is the foundation for an entirely new way for individuals to talk to their state and potentially eventually federal governments around what's happening with them economically, and getting them the right kind of data quickly so that you're limiting the amount of churn and back and forth around this process.
That's right. And adding a layer of automation. And I think your point on 1099 workers is that, unfortunately, right, what we see with social services is that, like a lot of things, they've been built around the backbone of a quote unquote traditional worker, right, which is someone who generates all of their income from a full-time W-2 job. The problem is that so many Americans that need those social services the most, and unfortunately, so many of those that are from underserved populations, minority populations, participate in alternative forms of work, right? They're doing 1099 work. They're working multiple jobs, right, to pay the bills, which is a whole nother discussion on why UBI needs to be there, because no one should be working multiple jobs, but they are, right? And the system is broken in that it has no mechanism for being able to provide a transfer of data for those individuals. And so there's a couple of factors. One is they're not aware of what they qualify for, right, which we see time and time again. And then secondarily, the big friction point is, they're required, as opposed to if you're a full-time W-2 worker, the state takes care of everything, right, when you apply. If you're a 1099 worker, you've got to go print out in certain instances your bank statements for 18 months and wait for someone to review 200 sheets of paper at the state agency that you might wait 6 months or a year for, right? That's not right.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned in there two things as you were talking. You've said the word automation many times, and for a lot of people in the basic income community, automation gets us to what's happening in the workspace, like what's happening with jobs and access to jobs now and down the line. And I think, and you started to hint on this, idea of you get to have a steady, via the data that you are looking at, you're able to have a pretty big picture view into what's happening in the space of work and income in ways that in some ways maybe we haven't ever seen collected together in one place. So I'd love to understand why, out of what you're seeing, why are you such a big proponent of guaranteed income? Why do you think this is an important next piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, I think part of it is I touched on is that people shouldn't be working 3 or 4 different jobs every month, right? people shouldn't be, after working 3 or 4 different jobs every month, paying $70 a month in overdraft fees because they are living so closely on the margin. If they're working 3 or 4 jobs, they shouldn't have to have no safety net, right? So that they can't be in a position where they can take care of themselves in the event of an expense shock or an income shock. And they shouldn't be in a position where they're working 3 or 4 jobs and they have no employer sponsored or public sector sponsored safety net, right? That's readily available. And what I'll say is, prior to the pandemic, right, we saw everything that I'm talking about, right, is a massive underemployment challenge, right? Because even the reason people were coming to study, millions of them, is they still couldn't find enough work, even though they were willing to work multiple jobs. Now, coming out of the backside of the pandemic, I'm frightened, right? Because yes, we do have a very unique look into the data set of nearly 4 million people who work at the largest employers in the country, doing everything from retail to hospitality to food services to logistics and transportation, gig work, whatever you want to call it. And those people that are going back to work, in many instances, are not earning what they were earning before, right? They're going back to work and they're going back at 15 hours a week instead of 25 or 30 for a single job. They're going back in jobs that have some type of tip-based income and their tips are lower, right? So that underemployment challenge is being hugely exacerbated. And when you hear about this huge number of job openings, right, those are not one-for-one jobs, right? Those are jobs that are not what they looked like pre-pandemic. They're service industry jobs with highly variable income levels, right? Based on, the flexibility of the hours that are provided. And so for me, that's frightening, right? And we're living in a world where you compound that now with the investment in automation, and there's not enough work, right? There's not enough work for people to do in order to generate what we should be providing in the way of a livable wage for people in the society that we're living in today. So I think it's a necessity, right? I don't think there's any way that we're going to survive, right, as an institution, right, to the extent that we don't move aggressively down this front.
Well, we're coming to the top of our time together. This has been, I feel like this is kind of ending on a little bit of a bleak.
I'm sorry.
This is the world you live in, Adam. So you're just like, welcome to it. But the work of, the work that you're doing to help make the implementation of demonstrations just so easy to do, that makes it so that, Moving Nashville Forward, who we talked to earlier this week, they are, as they talked about it, they're a group of volunteers who have come together and decided they're going to implement basic income in their community, which is incredibly powerful. And they're targeting, a pretty big sized pilot down the line. And so the ability to be able to work with organizations like Steady to be able to streamline that so that really as much money as possible is going into the pockets of people and not into the administrative. And the administrative, there's certain parts of the administrative of social work and community outreach and things like that are really critical. But if you can have the, less money going to somebody who's having to shuffle papers around, it means more money going into the hands of community members. And it's just so fabulous that you are, that you're doing that work and that you're just giving it to free for all the pilots, like it's there. And that is, it's very inspiring. And I'm excited to hear in 2022 where things go, because I know so many of these pilots are just starting to kick off or are going to soon. So looking forward to having next conversations in the spring of 2022 and see how things are going.
Well, thank you for your leadership, Stacey, in this regard, and I appreciate you having me.
Well, have a wonderful rest of your evening. We'll see you soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.